Perhaps no people in the Americas went to quite the same heights to honor their ancestors as the Chachapoya of northern Peru. From about AD 800 until the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, the Chachapoya regularly carried their dead hundreds of feet up imposing cliffs. There they placed the bundled remains in sarcophagi and in chamber tombs on platforms they constructed around natural crevices and ledges, as well as in cave entrances located on high escarpments. Surviving Chachapoya sarcophagi made of plaster and reeds, such as the vivid examples at the site of Carajilla, are well known to researchers, but archaeologists had conducted few recent systematic studies of these vertical cemeteries until University of Central Florida bioarchaeologist Marla Toyn and her team, aided by a group of Spanish cavers, explored the necropolis sites of La Petaca and Diablo Huasi in 2013 and 2016. During a series of daring expeditions that involved rappelling down the cliff face of La Petaca, Toyn and her team identified at least 125 separate structures filled with the jumbled remains of ancient Chachapoya people. They had to adapt traditional methods of archaeological excavation to their precarious surroundings, where many of the platforms, with burial chambers and bodies left in the open, may not have been able to support the excavator's weight. The extreme conditions made a deep impression on Toyn. Quote, "It was impossible to record these sites after a harrowing descent on ropes and not think about how the Chachapoya themselves climbed and moved around the rock face," unquote. She says, "Just why the tombs were located on the treacherous cliffs remains an open question. Perhaps they were significant markers of a group's territory, or perhaps there were other, more symbolical reasons for locating them in these high, inaccessible places." Radiocarbon dating of selected remains suggests each chamber tomb contained the skeletons of people who were interred in separate events over the course of many centuries. Initially, Toyn wondered if a specialized class of tomb builders might have done the perilous work of constructing these monuments. Most tombs were built on slate platforms with mortar-covered rock walls topped by a wooden roof. Some were extensively painted. The fact that so many tombs were located hundreds of feet up a cliff face suggests a considerable investment of time and labor, perhaps by Chachapoya possessing a rare ability to work in such a vertiginous setting. With careful study, Toyn identified a wide variation in the construction quality of tombs at La Petaca and Diablo Huasi, from relatively humble efforts to elaborate structures that must have required great skill to make. Quote, "There are some that are beautifully built with smooth walls and perfect 90-degree angles. They're gorgeous. Others look like they were constructed simply with just plaster and rock in an irregular fashion. There's a huge variation," unquote. Toyn now believes that it may have been common practice among the Chachapoya to undertake the trip up the cliffs to construct houses of the dead for their ancestors. Quote, "I think it was a family-based endeavor," unquote, she says. "They worked together to build their homes and to work with their land. There were people who were better at it than others, but overall, they worked as a community to build these tombs," unquote. Toyn points out that the fact many tombs are still standing despite considerable erosion and seismic activity in the area means that even those who weren't skilled builders were successful and expertly negotiated the challenges posed by the terrain. Quote, "We're the ones who are limited. We don't grow up naturally climbing rocks, but it's very possible that most people in the Chachapoya community could have toddled along these very narrow ledges like it was normal, because that was what they did, whereas we can't really move around on the cliffs safely without ropes," unquote. Toyn believes that the Chachapoya people not only interred their own relatives rather than relying on daredevil tomb builders, regularly visited their honored ancestors, treating them as part of the living community. Some ledges and platforms in front of the tombs at lower elevations bear evidence of cooking fires, perhaps suggesting families held feasts there. Quote, "These are not final, permanent, or complete burials. We have this idea today that burying a person involves finality, the end of a life, but the Chachapoya placed their dead in locations that they may have visited again and again, even if it was difficult to do," unquote. By regularly visiting the cliffs, the Chachapoya may have maintained familiar relationships with the dead, and the memory of the deceased may have persisted in the community for generations. The idea that the dead were part of the living community is also reflected in how they were positioned, sitting upright. "It's a simple dichotomy," says Toyn. "When you lie down, you are sleeping, not doing anything. But when you're seated upright with hands across your chest, as we see in the Chachapoya burial bundles, that's an active position. If you visited them, you would see them face to face, and some mummy bundles had faces painted on them," unquote. The fact that the dead were positioned in upright bundles, she says, suggests that the individuals were perhaps meant to be actively watched over the community below, and that they remained in constant communication with the living. Toyn and her team plan on returning to the region to follow up on their initial study as part of a broader investigation of Chachapoya funerary traditions. More radiocarbon dating of remains could help refine her understanding of how the Chachapoya used the site over time, and isotope analysis could provide deeper insights into the Chachapoya diet. She's also interested in the individual stories the remains can still tell. During a previous season, Twain and her team recovered the remains of 2 adult men positioned on either side of an entrance to one chamber tomb. Both had severe spinal deformities. What were their lives like in this environment, asks Twain. I want to go back and see who else is in that chamber. What are their stories, unquote. DNA analysis of the remains and others could also demonstrate how different lineages were treated in death. There is no living community that traces its ancestry back to the Chachapoya, and that might have retained the knowledge of why these great ancient people went to such great heights to honor their dead. I've thought long and hard about this, says Twain. I don't know what their psyche was, but I do know what mine, and that the risk aversion is a real human tendency. She notes that she may never fully comprehend why the Chachapoya built their cliff cemeteries. She states, the simple question for them was what to do with someone who had died. They could bury them in the ground, or they could climb up and construct and paint and create a sacred place for them. It meant something to them, and it was so important that they may have regularly risked their lives to create these spaces.